Now, Section 70202 is similar but different. No tax on overtime. So this was another one of the campaign promises from Trump. And basically, they are creating. So, so the way they do this is just hilarious. So if you remember back to the beginning of 70201, so they said, okay, we're bumping 224. That's now 225, and we're creating a new 224 with all this language. And now 70202 says, where was it? I think I just skipped by it. Yeah. Now the 225 that was just created by the previous section is now getting bumped to 226. And now a new 225 is created, qualified overtime compensation. Fun times. So in general, there shall be allowed as a deduction an amount equal to the qualified overtime compensation received during the taxable year and included on statements furnished to the individual pursuant to section 6041, 6051, whatever. That's W-2 kind of reporting. Limitation. The amount allowed as a deduction under this section for any taxable year shall not exceed $12,500, $25,000 in the case of joint returns. Limitation based on adjusted gross income, 150 or 300 for married filing joint. And same kind of phase out, $100 for every $1,000 by which the modified adjusted gross income exceeds those limits. So now, instead of getting a $25,000 deduction, we're going to get a $12,500 deduction, or $25,000 for a joint return. How much overtime does that account for? I don't know. It depends what you make, right? So let's say you make, I don't know, what's the average? Let's do a quick search. Let's do median wage 2025. Okay, so the median weekly earnings of the nation's 110.8 million full-time wage and salary workers aged 25 and over was 1258 in the first quarter of 2025. Okay, so 1258, that's per week. So times, let's just say divided by 40. So that's 31.45 an hour is the median wage. So let's say that you make 31.45, you're in the middle of the pack. Now your overtime is going to be time and a half, right? So it's times 1.5. So during overtime, you're going to be making 47.17 an hour. So how many hours does that eat up? Let's see, divide by 12,500 and flip it over. So it's 264, almost 265 hours of overtime if you're in that middle of the range as far as your hourly compensation. That's a fair amount, right? If we divide that by 50 weeks, that's 5 hours of overtime a week on average for that average earner or that median earner. It's technically not average. That's a fair amount. Some people work a lot of overtime. Some people work a little bit of overtime, but this will account for a good chunk of most people's overtime, I think, because you have to remember you have to be eligible for overtime, right? Which they get into here. So what is qualified overtime compensation? For purposes of this section, the term qualified overtime compensation means overtime compensation paid to an individual required under Section 7 of the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 that is in excess of the regular rate as used in such section at which such individual is employed. Basically, if you were eligible for overtime before under the Fair Labor Standards Act, so your hourly or your non-managerial, so this is what created that exempt, non-exempt category when it comes to employment. So if you've gotten overtime in the past, you're probably still qualified for this deduction. People who are not qualified, exclusion, you got to have a social security number, right? That's true for all the things. You can't be married filing separate. Same thing we saw in the tips section. The Secretary shall issue such regulations or other guidance as may be necessary or appropriate to carry out the purposes of this section, including regulations or other guidance to prevent the abuse of the deduction allowed by this section. So we don't know what this is going to say, but I imagine it will be something like, if you were exempt prior to December 31st, 2024, then you can't then downgrade and become non-exempt. And again, this is a temporary deduction. It ends in 2028. Also, deduction allowed to non-itemizers, similar to what we just saw. There's going to be some sort of field outside of the itemized deductions that allows for this deduction. I had a discussion on Twitter with a guy. I was like, where are they going to put this? I was like, yeah, I think they'll jam it all in Schedule 1, but I don't know. We'll see when the forms get actually created. But the IRS definitely has a lot of work in store for them to create the new forms to implement all these different changes. And reporting requirements are required to include an overtime compensation on W-2 as amended by preceding provisions of this act. Basically, they have to list out on the W-2 somehow how much of the compensation was subject to this overtime regime. omission of correct social security number treated as mathematical clerical error, saying they're not going to throw somebody in jail for wrong social security number. And yeah, qualified overtime compensation withholding. And just like we saw with the tips, the withholdings are supposed to be adjusted in 2026, 7 and 8. They will not be adjusted in 2025. And this goes into effect for 2025. Transition rule: in the case of qualified overtime compensation required to be reported for periods before January 1st, 2026, which means 2025, persons required to file returns or statements under all these sections may approximate a separate accounting of amounts designated as qualified overtime compensation by any reasonable method specified by the Secretary. So again, just like we saw with tips, because we're going into effect mid-year here, employers got to do their best as far as separating out the overtime versus the tips. That shouldn't be too hard. Most employers who are paying overtime do track those hours separately, so that should be pretty easy to tabulate. But very similar structure between the overtime deduction and the tips deduction. So what if you get tips and overtime? Well, you should have two different fields filled in your W-2, and you should get two separate deductions for those. It's all going to depend on that, but that'd be a pretty rare situation. Most employers who have people who get tips do not allow them to work overtime. I'd be surprised to see much, if any, people who are subject to both. All right, so that's section 70202.